Ibrahim Traoré has the coup plotters arrested and suffers upon discovering the betrayal of a childhood friend. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Ibrahim Traoré entered the crisis room. His uniform was impeccable, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed nights of vigilance. At just 34 years old, Traoré had become the world's youngest head of state after leading his own coup in 2022. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now faced a similar threat. "Mr. President," General Moussa said, placing a thick folder on the mahogany table, "our intelligence services have confirmed it. A coup is being organized against your government." The room fell silent. 8 military officers, all trusted advisors, watched their young leader's reaction carefully. Traoré's face remained impassive as he opened the folder and methodically examined its contents. Inside were photographs, transcripts of intercepted communications, bank statements, and a list of military officers involved in the conspiracy. "How reliable is this information?" Traoré asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Beyond doubt, sir," responded Colonel Zaré, head of military intelligence. "We have multiple sources, electronic surveillance, and photographic evidence of meetings. The conspirators plan to strike within 48 hours. Traoré nodded, turning the pages slowly, studying each face in the photographs. These were men he knew. Officers who had sworn allegiance to Burkina Faso, some who had even fought alongside him against jihadist insurgents in the north. Yet here they were plotting in the shadows. "Their grievances?" he asked, though he could guess the answer. "They claim your government has not done enough to secure the country against terrorist threats. They're using the recent attacks in Djibo as proof of failure, and..." General Moussa hesitated. "Speak freely, General." "They're also claiming that your ties with Russia and distancing from France have isolated us internationally." Traoré closed the folder and looked at each of his advisors in turn. The heat in the room seemed to intensify despite the air conditioning. "What they fail to understand," he said finally, "is that breaking free from neo-colonial influence takes time. Our country has been bleeding for decades because of these same foreign powers they wish to appease." He stood up and walked to the large map of Burkina Faso hanging on the wall. His finger traced the northern regions where insurgent groups had established footholds. "We will act decisively, but without unnecessary bloodshed," he announced. "I want these conspirators arrested, not killed, not tortured. Arrested. The people of Burkina Faso need justice, not revenge." His orders were specific and methodical. Special forces teams would simultaneously arrest the conspirators across the country. No public announcements until all were in custody. Maximum discretion, to prevent panic or violence. Within hours, the operation was underway. Military helicopters deployed to remote regions while unmarked vehicles surrounded residences in Ouagadougou. By nightfall, reports began flowing back to the crisis room. Target Alpha secured. Target Bravo in custody. One by one, the conspirators were apprehended without a single shot fired. The streets of Ouagadougou remained calm, unaware of the crisis that had been averted. It was only the following morning, when Traoré addressed the nation on state television, that the people learned how close the country had come to another violent power transfer. "Citizens of Burkina Faso," he began, his expression solemn. "Yesterday, our security forces neutralized a plot against your democratically established government. Those responsible are now in custody and will face justice according to our laws. Let me be clear, no traitor to our nation will go unpunished." As news spread, people gathered in Liberty Square, waving the national flag and chanting Traoré's name. Market women ululated in celebration, students organized impromptu rallies, and even political opponents acknowledged the government's restraint in handling the situation. Back in his office, Traoré reviewed the detailed reports of the arrests. Each conspirator had been taken without incident, except one general who had attempted to flee to neighboring Ghana. Something about the reports troubled him, though, a sense that they weren't seeing the complete picture. "Sir?" his aide interrupted, entering with an additional file. "This was found during a search of General Ouedraogo's home. Traoré opened the new file, and as he scanned its contents, a document slipped out and fell to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, and the name printed at the top of the page stopped his heart. Souleymane Traoré. "This can't be right," he whispered. The aide shifted uncomfortably. "Sir?" But Traoré couldn't speak. The name on the document belonged to his oldest friend, his brother, in all but blood. The boy who had defended him in schoolyard fights, who had entered military service alongside him, who had been by his side during the darkest days of combat against insurgent forces. "Leave me," he ordered, his voice barely audible. Alone, Traoré stared at the document, a cold sweat breaking on his forehead. If Souleymane was involved, this conspiracy ran deeper than he had imagined, and the betrayal cut deeper than any blade could reach. Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his office as midnight approached, the name on the document burning in his mind, Souleymane Traoré. He couldn't reconcile the evidence before him with the memories that flooded his consciousness. How could his most trusted friend be involved in a plot to overthrow him? His mind drifted back to their childhood in Bobo Dioulasso, Burkina Faso's second-largest city. They were just 8 years old when they first met. Two skinny boys playing football with a ball made of tightly bound plastic bags in the dusty streets. Souleymane was always the bolder one, with a quick smile and quicker reflexes. Ibrahim, more reserved and thoughtful, admired his new friend's fearlessness. The memory of his 11th birthday remained vivid, how a group of older boys had cornered him on his way home from school, demanding the new watch his mother had saved for months to buy him. Before they could take it, Souleymane had appeared, outnumbered but undaunted. "Touch him," Souleymane had said, "and you'll answer to me and my brothers." The bullies, knowing Souleymane's older brother's reputation, had backed away. That day, Souleymane had declared them blood brothers, cutting his palm with a small knife and pressing it against Ibrahim's. "Now we're family," he had said, "and family protects each other, always." Years later, when Ibrahim decided to enroll in military service after university, it was Souleymane who immediately said he would join too. "Where you go, I go," he had insisted. They trained together, were deployed together, faced the horrors of combat together. When Ibrahim confided his dreams of a better Burkina Faso, free from corruption and foreign influence, Souleymane had been the first to believe in his vision. "How?" Traoré whispered to the empty room. "How could you do this?" He couldn't order Souleymane's arrest based solely on a document that mentioned his name. He needed more evidence, or perhaps he needed to prove his friend's innocence. With hands that trembled slightly, he picked up his secure phone and called Colonel Zaré. "I need a discreet surveillance operation," he said. "No official record, just you and your most trusted men." Within an hour, Zaré had assembled a small team in Traoré's private quarters. The president gave them explicit instructions: monitor Souleymane Traoré's movements, communications, and contacts, but do not, under any circumstances, alert him to the surveillance. "If he's innocent, no one ever needs to know about this," Traoré said firmly. "If he's guilty..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The next 48 hours were excruciating. Traoré maintained his public schedule: meetings with ministers, a visit to a new infrastructure project, a conference call with regional leaders, all while receiving regular updates from Zaré's team. Souleymane, currently serving as a liaison officer between the military and rural communities in the north, appeared to be conducting routine business. Then came the first troubling report. Souleymane had veered from his official itinerary to meet with a civilian in a remote area near the Mali border. The civilian was identified as Issouf Diallo, a businessman with known connections to opposition figures. It could be innocent, Traoré told himself. He knows many people across the country. But the next day, surveillance captured Souleymane entering an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, a location not on any official schedule. He remained inside for nearly 2 hours. When he emerged, he was carrying a different bag than when he had entered. We need visual confirmation of what happened in that warehouse, Traoré ordered. His security team deployed a drone to survey the location and discovered it was being used as a meeting place. Hidden cameras placed afterward revealed a rotation of visitors, including 3 military officers who had not been identified in the original coup plot, and a foreign national tentatively identified as a private military contractor with Russian connections. The final piece of evidence arrived in the form of an intercepted audio recording. Zareh delivered it personally to Traoré at 3 a.m., apologizing for the late hour but insisting on its significance. With a heavy heart, Traoré pressed play. Soleiman's voice was unmistakable. Ibrahim has lost his way. He thinks he's changing. The system is changing him. We need to transform things from the inside out. When the time comes, make sure the Northern Battalions stand down. I'll handle Traoré myself. Traoré replayed the recording 3 times, searching for any context that might explain away the apparent betrayal. Each time, the words cut deeper. He was my brother, Traoré said quietly, his eyes burning with unshed tears. I trusted him with my life. What are your orders, Mr. President? Zareh asked, his expression somber. Traoré stared out the window at the sleeping city, the capital of a nation that had endured so much bloodshed, so many coups and counter-coups. The easy path would be to have Soleiman arrested immediately, publicly denounced as a traitor. It would send a clear message to anyone else considering betrayal. But something held him back. Decades of friendship, of shared struggles and dreams. I need to see him, Traoré said finally. Face to face. No security, no official capacity, just us. Sir, that's extremely dangerous. If he's involved in a coup plot, that's my decision, Traoré cut him off. Arrange it. A neutral location. Tell him I need to speak with him about a sensitive community matter. Don't arouse suspicion. As Zareh left to make the arrangements, Traoré pulled an old photograph from his desk drawer, himself and Soleiman in their first military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning with the optimism of youth. They had sworn to serve their country, to protect its people, to never become like the corrupt leaders they despised. What happened to us? He whispered to the image of his friend. What changed? The village of Kongusi lay 115 kilometers north of Ouagadougou. Its mud brick houses clustered around a small marketplace and a weather-beaten mosque. In the dry season, dust coated everything. The acacia trees, the corrugated metal roofs, the faces of children playing in the narrow streets. It was here, far from the capital's political intrigues, that Ibrahim Traoré had arranged to meet Souleymane Kaboré. Traoré arrived without fanfare. Dressed in civilian clothes, driving a nondescript SUV. He had insisted on coming alone, though he knew Colonel Zareh had positioned a small team of operatives in the surrounding area, a precaution the security chief had refused to forego. The house belonged to an elderly imam who had once taught both boys during a summer when Traoré's family had visited relatives in the area. It was a simple dwelling with earthen floors and walls adorned only with calligraphic verses from the Quran. The imam, now nearly blind, had been taken to stay with his son in a neighboring village, told only that a private government meeting required the use of his home. Traoré knocked once and entered. The main room was dim, illuminated only by shafts of sunlight through small windows. In the center, kneeling on a prayer mat, was Soleiman. He wasn't praying as Traoré first thought. He was waiting, his head bowed, knowing why his friend had summoned him. Slowly, Soleiman raised his head. Their eyes met across the room, and decades of shared history hung in the air between them. Neither spoke for a long moment. The silence, heavy with unspoken accusations and explanations. Salam alaikum, Soleiman finally said, his voice soft. Alaikum salam, Traoré responded automatically, the traditional greeting a painful reminder of their shared faith and values. Traoré remained standing by the door, his hand unconsciously moving to the pistol concealed beneath his jacket. You know why I'm here. Soleiman nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. I've been expecting this conversation. Though I thought you'd send soldiers, not come yourself. I needed to hear it from you, Traoré said, his voice strained. With emotion he fought to control. Why, after everything we've been through together, why betray me, betray our country? Souleymane rose to his feet, a tall man whose once athletic frame had grown leaner with age and responsibility. Is that what you think? That I've betrayed Burkina Faso? A bitter laugh escaped him. I've spent my life serving this country, Ibrahim, just like you. Don't, Traoré warned, his voice hardening. I have the evidence, the meetings, the conspirators, the plans. I have your voice on tape, talking about handling me yourself. Souleymane didn't deny it. Instead, he moved to a small, wooden table and poured water from a clay pitcher into 2 cups. He offered one to Traoré, who didn't move to take it. Remember when we were students? Souleymane asked, setting Traoré's untouched cup on a low stool between them. How we used to talk about Thomas Sankara for hours. His vision for our country, his refusal to bow to foreign powers, his dedication to the people. Don't you dare invoke Sankara's name to justify what you've done. But that's exactly why I've done what I've done, Ibrahim. Souleymane's eyes flashed with sudden intensity. What happened to that young man who quoted Sankara's speeches? Who promised to put the people first? Who swore never to become just another dictator in uniform? Traoré felt anger rising in his chest. You think I've become a dictator? I've spent every day fighting to secure our country from terrorists, to build infrastructure, to create a Burkina Faso that stands on its own feet. While surrounding yourself with yes men and distancing yourself from those who tell you hard truths, Souleymane countered. When was the last time you visited a village without cameras? When did you last sit with ordinary citizens and truly listen to them? Your security forces are becoming heavy-handed, Ibrahim. There are whispers of disappearances, of journalists threatened. Lies spread by our enemies, Traoré snapped. Are they? Souleymane asked quietly. Or have you stopped listening? The Ibrahim I knew would have investigated such claims himself, not dismissed them. The accusation struck Traoré like a physical blow. He had indeed been increasingly isolated, trusting fewer people, delegating investigations to subordinates. The pressures of leadership, the constant threats from extremist groups, the international criticism, all had taken their toll. So you decided to overthrow me, he asked, his voice hollow. To become just like all the others who have torn our country apart with coups and counter-coups? Souleymane's shoulders sagged slightly. No, not overthrow. Remind. Challenge. Force you to see what's happening around you. He took a step forward. We plan to confront you with evidence of abuses, to demand reforms, to bring back the advisors you've pushed away. It was an intervention. Ibrahim, not a coup. You expect me to believe that? Traoré's laugh was harsh. Armed men were involved. Foreign mercenaries. Secret meetings. Because we knew how tight your security had become, how paranoid some of your guards are. Souleymane shook his head. We needed protection in case things went wrong, but no one was to harm you. I made that clear from the beginning. For a moment, doubt crept into Traoré's mind. Could it be true? Had he misinterpreted their intentions? But then he remembered the recorded words. I'll handle Traoré myself. You could have come to me directly, Traoré said, his voice barely above a whisper. You, of all people, could have walked into my office any time and spoken freely. Sadness crossed Souleymane's features. I tried, brother. 3 times in the past year I raised concerns, each time you brushed them aside. Each time I was given fewer responsibilities afterward, moved further from the center of decision-making. Traoré searched his memory and found, to his dismay, that Souleymane was right. He had dismissed his friend's concerns about certain appointments, about the growing influence of military hardliners, about neglected regions in the country's east. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the village sounds continued. Children playing, a donkey braying, women calling to each other as they returned from the well. Life continuing, oblivious to the momentous conversation taking place inside the imam's simple home. What happens now? Souleymane finally asked. Traoré's hand moved away from his concealed weapon. With a subtle movement, he pressed a button on his phone, sending a prearranged signal to Zare's team. "You know I can't let this go," he said softly. "Whatever your intentions, you conspired against the government. That can't stand," Soleiman nodded, resignation in his eyes. "I expected nothing less from you, always the principled one." A sad smile touched his lips. "Remember when the school principal caught us stealing fruit from his garden? You insisted we confess even though he'd never have known it was us." Despite everything, a ghost of a smile crossed Traoré's face at the memory. "You called me a fool, and then stood beside you while we both received punishment." Suleiman's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't regret trying to help you. Remember who you are, Ibrahim. I only regret that it came to this." The door opened behind Traoré, and Colonel Zare entered with 4 soldiers, their weapons at the ready. "Colonel Caboret," Zare said formally, "you are under arrest for conspiracy against the state." Soleiman didn't resist as they bound his hands. As they prepared to lead him out, he looked one last time at Traoré. "Are you still that boy who dreamed of changing the world, Ibrahim?" he asked softly. Traoré couldn't answer. He watched in silence as his oldest friend was led away, head bowed, tears finally breaking free to trace paths down his weathered cheeks. The news spread across Burkina Faso like wildfire in the dry season. Colonel Souleymane Kaboré, decorated war hero and childhood friend of President Ibrahim Traoré, had been arrested for his role in a conspiracy against the government. State television broadcast images of Kaboré being escorted to the military tribunal, his face impassive, his military uniform replaced by civilian clothes. For many citizens, the revelation was incomprehensible. Kaboré was no ordinary officer. He was a national figure, celebrated for his bravery in fighting extremist groups in the northern regions, admired for his work with vulnerable rural communities. Stories of his friendship with Traoré had become part of the national narrative. 2 boys from modest backgrounds who rose together to serve their country. The investigation has revealed Colonel Kaboré's involvement in planning the recently thwarted attempt to destabilize our constitutional order. The official statement read, "No individual, regardless of rank or relationship, stands above the law of Burkina Faso." In the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré withdrew from public view. He canceled scheduled appearances, delegated meetings to his ministers, and instructed his staff that he was not to be disturbed except for matters of national emergency. Security personnel reported that lights burned in his private office throughout the night, but few were admitted to speak with him. Inside that office, Traoré sat surrounded by files, not the evidence against Souleymane, which he had reviewed exhaustively, but photographs, letters, and mementos from their shared past. A yellowed newspaper clipping showed them as young officers receiving commendations for bravery during an operation against militants. Another photograph captured them in their early 20s, arms around each other's shoulders at a friend's wedding, grinning with the invincibility of youth. On his desk lay a framed picture he had kept since their military academy days, both of them in crisp cadet uniforms, standing at attention but with barely suppressed smiles. They had been so full of idealism then, so certain they would change their country's destiny. "Mr. President?" His chief of staff stood at the door, hesitating, to disturb his solitude. Traoré looked up, his eyes reddened from lack of sleep. "What is it?" "Sir, there's a letter for you. From Madame Kaboré, Colonel Kaboré's grandmother." Traoré felt his heart constrict. Grandmother Aisha had practically raised both boys during school holidays, feeding them, scolding them, teaching them the values of honor and integrity. When they stayed in her small house in Bobo Dioulasso, she had been like a second mother to him. "Bring it," he said, his voice hoarse. The letter was written in a shaky hand on simple-lined paper. No formal address, no ceremonial language, just the direct words of an elderly woman to the boy she had helped raise. "Ibrahim, my son, I write not to the president but to the child who sat at my table. Since Soleiman was taken, I have prayed for understanding. My grandson is not perfect, but his heart has always been true. Whatever he has done, remember this. He loved you as a brother. In all my years, I have never seen two souls more connected. Power changes men, but love remains. Do what justice demands, but do not let bitterness poison what was pure. Your mother and I raised you to be strong enough to forgive, even when it hurts most deeply. I remain, as always, your second mother, Aisha. Traoré read the letter 3 times, each reading more painful than the last. He carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the few precious items he had kept from his mother who had passed years before. That evening, his defense minister requested an urgent meeting. Mr. President, the minister began, carefully, there are concerns about sympathizers of Colonel Traoré within the military. Some suggest we should conduct a wider purge, perhaps transfer officers who were close to him to remote postings. Traoré looked at him sharply. No, there will be no purges, no collective punishment. Those with evidence against them will face justice. Everyone else continues their duties. But sir, as a precaution, I said no. Traoré's voice was quiet, but firm. And the colonel's family is to be left in peace. No surveillance, no harassment. Am I understood? The minister nodded, somewhat surprised by the president's vehemence on this point. After he left, Traoré stood at his office window, looking out over Ouagadougou as evening fell. Lights began to flicker on across the city, in government buildings, in markets, in humble homes where families gathered for dinner. The lives of ordinary citizens continued while he grappled with the weight of his decisions. His aide entered without knocking, alarm evident on his face. Sir, you need to see this. Channel 4 is broadcasting an unauthorized interview with a military officer claiming Colonel Traoré was framed. On the television screen, a Captain Traoré recognized, a junior officer from Traoré's unit, was speaking passionately. The colonel is innocent. He only wanted reforms, not a coup. President Traoré has been misled by his advisors. Traoré watched silently as security forces entered the broadcast studio, and the transmission was cut mid-sentence. What are your orders, sir? His aide asked, nervously. The captain has been detained. Traoré closed his eyes briefly, exhaustion washing over him. Release him, no charges. But sir, the public statements, people are allowed to have opinions, even misguided ones, Traoré said. If we start arresting everyone who speaks out, what Souleymane said about me would be true. Those words, spoken aloud for the first time, hung in the air. What Souleymane said about me would be true. Had his friend been right? Had he begun to change, to lose touch with the ideals that once drove him? That night, after dismissing his staff, Traoré made a decision. The next morning he would address the nation, not with the usual carefully scripted speech delivered from behind a desk, but something more personal. The broadcast was announced with minimal notice. When the cameras went live, they showed not the formal presidential office, but a simple setting. Traoré seated in a wooden chair wearing a traditional Burkinabe shirt, rather than his usual suit or uniform. My fellow citizens, he began, his voice steady but tinged with an emotion rarely displayed in public. I speak to you today not only as your president, but as a man facing one of the most difficult moments of his life. He spoke plainly about the coup attempt, the evidence that had been gathered, and the legal proceedings that would follow. But then his tone changed, becoming more personal. Among those arrested was Colonel Souleymane Traoré, a man known to many of you as a dedicated officer, but known to me since childhood as a brother in all but blood. Traoré's voice wavered slightly. The pain I feel is not from the attempted coup. It is from losing someone who has been part of my life's journey from our days playing in the dusty streets of Bobo Dioulasso. Across the country, people gathered around television sets and radios, stunned by this unprecedented display of vulnerability from their usually stoic leader. Justice must be served, and the rule of law must prevail, Traoré continued. But today, I ask you to remember that even in times of betrayal and pain, we must not lose our humanity, for if we do, we lose everything that makes Burkina Faso worthy of our sacrifices. As the broadcast ended, the nation remained silent, moved by what they had witnessed. For the first time, Many saw their president not as a distant figure of authority, but as a human being carrying the same burdens of pain and loss that touched their own lives. In his cell in the military detention center, Souleymane Traoré watched the broadcast on a small television. As his friend's face disappeared from the screen, he covered his face with his hands and wept, not for himself, but for the brotherhood that had been shattered in the unforgiving crucible of power and principle. "Mr. President," she said softly, "my son wanted to meet you. His name is—" She hesitated briefly. "Souleymane." Traoré looked down at the boy, who stared back with curious, unblinking eyes. For a moment, the president was silent. Then he knelt, down to the child's level. "That's a very important name," he said gently. "It means man of peace in our language. Do you know that?" The boy shook his head, suddenly shy in the presence of the country's leader. "Well, it's true," Traoré continued. "And people with important names have important work to do in this world. Perhaps one day you'll study at this academy." The child nodded solemnly, and Traoré reached into his pocket, pulling out a small pin bearing the national flag of Burkina Faso. He fastened it to the boy's shirt collar. "For a future leader," he said with a smile. As the woman led her son away, Traoré felt something shift within him, not forgiveness perhaps, but movement toward healing, like the first rain that softens the hard earth after the long dry season. That night, alone in his study, Traoré drafted a decree that would never be made public. It directed prison authorities to improve conditions in the section where Souleymane was held, to provide him with books and writing materials, and to allow supervised visits from his family, including his elderly grandmother. The decree mentioned national security reasons, but those close to the president understood the true motivation. 2 years passed. The Brothers of the Nation program expanded to every province in Burkina Faso. Schools were rebuilt, teachers trained, and thousands of young people given opportunities they would never otherwise have had. Security situations in the northern regions improved gradually, as development projects and community engagement complemented military operations against extremist groups. On the 3rd anniversary of the failed coup, Traoré visited a remote village near the Mali border, an area once considered too dangerous for presidential visits. As he spoke with community leaders about their needs and concerns, a military aide approached discreetly with an urgent message. Grandmother Aisha, now 93 years old, had fallen ill. Doctors gave her little time. Her last wish was to see both the boys she had helped raise, now a president and a prisoner, together once more. Without hesitation, Traoré ordered his helicopter prepared. Within hours, arrangements were made for Souleymane to be transported under guard to his grandmother's home in Bobo Dioulasso, where she lay waiting. The two men arrived separately. Traoré entered first, taking the frail hand of the woman who had been like a second mother to him. Despite her weakness, her eyes were clear and determined. "You came," she whispered. "Both of you?" "Yes, mother," Traoré replied, using the term of respect he had always called her. "Souleymane is here too." When Souleymane entered, escorted by guards, the years of imprisonment showed on his face. His once robust frame had thinned and gray streaked his temples. But his eyes, when they met Traoré's across the room, held the same directness they always had. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, at a nod from Traoré, the guard stepped outside, leaving the three alone. "My boys," Grandmother Aisha said, her voice barely audible. "Together again." With tremendous effort, she reached for both their hands, bringing them together over her chest. "Promise me something." Both men leaned closer to hear her fading words. "Remember why you began," she whispered. "Not power, not glory, but to serve." Her grip tightened momentarily. "And forgive. Life is too short for hearts to stay broken." As the sun set over Bobo Dioulasso, Grandmother Aisha slipped away peacefully, her last wish fulfilled. The two boys she had helped raise, now men shaped by triumph and tragedy, together at her side. They remained in silence for some time after she was gone. Finally, Soleiman spoke. "She never stopped believing in both of us," he said quietly. "Even when we stopped believing in each other." Traoré nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Outside, the guards waited expectantly. The authorized time for the prisoner's compassionate release was ending. But before Soleiman was escorted back to the transport vehicle, Traoré reached into his pocket and pressed something into his former friend's hand. It was the photograph from their military academy days, both in cadet uniforms, standing at attention with barely suppressed smiles. "She was right," Traoré said simply, "about remembering why we began." 1 month later, on National Day, President Ibrahim Traoré announced a limited amnesty program for political prisoners who had demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to peaceful participation in national life. The program included a rigorous review process and strict conditions, including community service and regular monitoring. Among the first names approved for the program was Colonel Souleymane Kaboré. The decision sparked controversy. Opposition. Leaders accused Traoré of favoritism, while hardliners in his own government warned of security risks. But the president stood firm, arguing that national reconciliation required both justice and mercy. Soleiman was released into a supervised program that required him to work with youth in conflict-affected areas, using his military experience not for combat, but for healing community divisions. He was barred from political activity and military service for life, restrictions he accepted without complaint. The two men did not meet privately again. Their paths crossed occasionally at public events, where they exchanged formal greetings, appropriate to their positions. But those close to both noted that something fundamental had shifted. The bitter enmity that had followed the betrayal had given way to a complex, unspoken understanding. 5 years after the failed coup at the graduation ceremony for the first class of the Brothers of the Nation Academy, both men were present, Traoré as the head of state delivering the keynote address, Souleymane as a mentor in the community service program, seated quietly at the back of the audience. As the ceremony concluded, a sudden rainstorm erupted, one of the dramatic downpours typical of the region. Attendees scattered for shelter, and in the confusion, the two men found themselves taking cover under the same awning. For a moment, they stood awkwardly side by side, watching the rain transform the dusty ground into mud. Then, unexpectedly, Souleymane laughed, a genuine sound that transported them both back to their youth, to countless rainy seasons spent together. Despite himself, Traoré smiled. "Your grandmother would be pleased," he said, gesturing to the graduates proudly clutching their diplomas as they ran through the rain, "to see what they've become." "What we've all become," Soleiman replied quietly. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the dust of the dry season, they stood together in silence, not as the friends they once were, perhaps, but no longer as enemies. Two sons of Burkina Faso who had traveled very different roads but found themselves, finally, working toward the same horizon. Later that evening, alone in his office, Traoré drafted notes for a memoir he had begun writing, a record for future generations of the challenges his administration had faced and overcome. He paused at a blank page, considering how to address the most painful chapter of his presidency. After long reflection, he wrote a single sentence. "The most devastating blow does not come from weapons, but from the hand once extended in friendship, and, yet, from pain comes hope, from betrayal comes wisdom, and from loss comes the chance to build anew." Then he closed the book, knowing the story was still being written, not just his own, but that of a nation struggling to heal its wounds and face its future with courage and unity.